The morning mist clung to the ancient oaks of Somerset Hall like a widow's veil, transforming the November landscape into something ghostly and unreal, as though the world itself mourned the passing of warmer days. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the window of the Dowager's sitting room, her practiced fingers arranging the tea service with a precision born of 2 decades in service, watching the groundskeeper's boy rake copper leaves into great mounds that the wind would scatter again by afternoon. A futile exercise, much like her own existence, she thought with the particular melancholy that came to her most mornings now. She was 40 years old, a fact that pressed upon her consciousness with increasing weight as each birthday arrived unmarked, save for Lady Somerset's kind remembrance, and she had long since accepted that her life would be measured not in her own joys, but in her ability to anticipate and fulfill the needs of others. The silver teapot caught her reflection as she polished it to gleaming, and she glimpsed the woman she had become, hair more grey than brown now, drawn back in a sensible knot, eyes still clear but framed by lines that spoke of too many nights reading by insufficient candlelight, a face that might once have been called handsome, but now merely conveyed competence and the invisible quality that all companions must cultivate to survive in grand houses. Through the floorboards came the chatter of the younger maids preparing the breakfast room, and Eleanor's ears, trained to catch whispers meant to be private, distinguished her name amidst their cruel amusement. 40 and never even had a suitor, can you imagine? Came Sarah's voice, dripping with the careless cruelty of 20. My mother says no man will want a woman past her bloom, and Miss Ashworth's bloom withered long before she came here. The words landed like familiar blows, painful still despite their regularity, and Eleanor forced herself to continue her preparations without pause, without acknowledgement, her hands steady as she measured the Dowager's preferred blend of tea leaves, though something inside her chest constricted painfully. Asterisk past her bloom. Asterisk. The phrase echoed in the chambers of her heart, where she had once harbored foolish dreams of love, of partnership, of a life that belonged to her rather than existing in service to others. She had been 19 when she first came to Somerset Hall, orphaned and desperate for respectability, and she had told herself then that her position was temporary, that surely some gentleman of modest means would see past her lack of fortune to the qualities she possessed: her education, her gentle nature, her capacity for devotion. But the years had accumulated like dust in forgotten corners, and gradually she had understood what the world had been trying to tell her all along, that women like her, without beauty or wealth or influential family, were meant to fade into the background of other people's stories, to be the hands that poured tea and turned pages and held yarn, never the heroines of their own narratives. The clock struck 7, its measured chimes marking another day in an endless succession of days, and Eleanor lifted the tea tray with the grace that had become second nature, preparing to attend to Lady Somerset's morning routine, carrying with her the quiet resignation that was both her armor and her prison, never imagining that before the month ended, a man would arrive who would shatter every certainty she had built around her unmarriageable heart. The household transformed the following afternoon when Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, assembled the servants with unprecedented gravity to announce that His Grace, the Duke of Thornwood, would arrive within 3 days to take residence at Somerset Hall for a fortnight's visit with Lady Somerset, and Eleanor watched the familiar corridors erupt into a frenzy of preparation that seemed to shake the very foundations of their ordered existence. Every surface was subjected to additional polishing, every carpet beaten within an inch of its life, every crystal chandelier dismantled and reassembled with painstaking care, and Eleanor found herself swept into the current of activity, though her particular responsibility emerged only when Lady Somerset summoned her to the morning room with a request that sent ice flooding through her veins. "The Duke is an avid scholar," Lady Somerset explained, her aged hands folded atop her walking stick, her eyes still sharp despite her 70 years watching Eleanor with an expression that might have been calculation or kindness, or perhaps both. "He will require the library prepared to his exacting standards, and you, my dear Eleanor, are the only person in this household with sufficient education to arrange the volumes in a manner that will please him." Eleanor accepted the commission with her customary grace, though her heart hammered against her ribs as she descended to the library that same afternoon, arms laden with fresh candles and beeswax polish, entering the vast room with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and the scent of leather and old paper that had always brought her comfort in her loneliest hours. She was arranging a collection of philosophical texts when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall, the arrival of horses, the scrape of trunks being unloaded. "Mrs. Dalton's voice raised in welcome, and she froze, her hands still upon the spine of Locke's treatise, listening to the footsteps that seemed to echo through the house with an authority that made her acutely aware of her own insignificance. When the library door opened, she had not yet composed herself, and she turned from the ladder where she perched to find herself looking down into the face of a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the ancient cliffs beyond the estate, his features austere and commanding, his eyes the color of winter storms, his tall frame dressed in black that spoke of recent mourning, and for one suspended moment, their gazes locked, and Eleanor felt as though he could see directly into the careful fortress she had built around her resigned heart. "You must be Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of privilege, tempered by something deeper, something weary. Lady Somerset mentioned her companion possessed unusual learning. Eleanor descended the ladder with as much dignity as she could muster, her hands trembling slightly as she curtsied, murmuring the appropriate words of welcome, while every instinct screamed that this man was dangerous to her carefully maintained equilibrium. He moved through the library with the assurance of one accustomed to owning everything his gaze touched, examining her arrangements with an attention that felt far too penetrating, and when he paused before the section she had devoted to natural philosophy, she heard herself offering an explanation of her organizational system that he received with a nod of what might have been approval. Then Lady Somerset's voice called from the hallway, and the Duke turned to answer her summons, but not before Eleanor caught the way his eyes returned to her once more, assessing, considering, seeing her in a way that made her feel simultaneously exposed and oddly validated. That evening, when Mrs. Dalton delivered the news that sent Eleanor's world tilting on its axis, that Lady Somerset had taken ill with a terrible cold that would confine her to bed for the duration of the Duke's visit, and that Eleanor, as the only woman of education and refinement in the household, must serve as hostess in her stead, Eleanor found herself gripping the back of a chair for support, her mind reeling at the impossibility of what was being asked, the impropriety of a paid companion presuming to such a role, the absolute certainty that she would be crushed beneath the weight of expectations she could never meet, yet knowing too that refusal was unthinkable, that duty demanded she accept this impossible charge, and that somewhere in the terrified chambers of her heart, a dangerous, foolish hope was beginning to unfurl its wings, despite every lesson life had taught her about the folly of dreaming beyond one's station. Eleanor stood at the head of the dining table that evening, with the sensation that she had been placed upon a stage without having learned her lines, the candlelight casting shadows that seemed to dance mockingly across the damask tablecloth as she attempted to embody a role for which 40 years of life had left her utterly unprepared, and across the expanse of polished mahogany sat the Duke of Thornwood, his dark eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her acutely conscious of every gesture, every word, every breath she drew into her constricted lungs. The first course arrived with agonizing slowness, and she forced herself to make conversation about the estate, about the unusually mild autumn, about anything that might fill the silence, stretching between them, like a chasm she had no means to bridge. But the Duke's responses were measured and thoughtful in a way that suggested he was studying her rather than merely exchanging pleasantries. And when the footman cleared the soup bowls, His Grace leaned back in his chair with an expression that might have been amusement or curiosity or something else entirely. "I noticed in the library that you had placed Wollstonecraft's work among the philosophical texts rather than with the novels," he observed, his voice carrying a note that seemed designed to test her, and Eleanor felt the familiar heat of being examined flood her cheeks, even as she lifted her chin with what dignity she could muster. "A vindication of the rights of woman is philosophy, Your Grace, regardless of the author's sex or society's determination to dismiss her arguments as mere sentiment," she replied, the words emerging with more force than she had intended, born of 2 decades of having her own intelligence patronized and diminished, and she watched something shift in the Duke's expression, something that looked remarkably like approval warming those winter storm eyes. The servants exchanged glances she could read even without turning her head, their scandalized whispers carrying just enough for her to catch the words "presumptuous" and "forgetting her place." and Eleanor felt the familiar shame begin to rise before the Duke's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts with unexpected gentleness. "I quite agree, Miss Ashworth, though I confess I have met few people willing to voice such an opinion, and fewer still who have clearly read the work with the attention it deserves." And there was something in the way he spoke to her, as though she were his equal rather than a paid companion presuming far above her station, that made Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses tremble like autumn leaves in a rising wind. The remainder of dinner passed in a haze of conversation that ranged from literature to politics to the philosophical questions that had occupied thinkers for centuries, and Eleanor found herself responding with an ease she had not known since her girlhood, before the world had taught her that women, especially unmarried, aging women without fortune, were meant to ornament rather than contribute, to agree rather than debate, to fade rather than shine. Yet here was this man, this Duke whose consequence was so far above her own as to be laughable, treating her observations as worthy of consideration, and the experience left her dizzy with emotions she could not name and dared not examine. When the evening finally concluded and she retreated to her small chamber beneath the eaves, Eleanor found sleep impossible, her mind replaying every moment of the dinner, every glance the Duke had given her, every instance where he had seemed to truly see her rather than merely looking through her to something more important beyond. And she told herself sternly that she was being foolish, that his courtesy meant nothing beyond good breeding, that men of his station did not see women like her as anything but conveniences. Yet even as she formed these thoughts, she remembered the way his gaze had lingered when he bid her good night, the way his voice had softened when he thanked her for her company, and in the darkness of her room, Eleanor Ashworth lay awake until dawn, caught between the terror of hoping and the greater terror of what it might mean if that hope were somehow, impossibly, not entirely unfounded. Eleanor descended to the library the following morning, with the intention of losing herself in the familiar comfort of cataloguing and arranging, hoping that the methodical work might quiet the tumultuous thoughts that had plagued her through another sleepless night. But she had scarcely begun when the door opened, and the Duke entered with an expression that suggested he, too, had sought refuge in this sanctuary of leather and paper and accumulated wisdom. "Miss Ashworth." He greeted her with a slight inclination of his head, his voice carrying that same quality of thoughtful attention that had so unsettled her the previous evening, and she curtsied in response, murmuring something appropriate about hoping he had slept well, though the shadows beneath his eyes suggested his rest had been no more successful than her own. They stood for a moment in the peculiar tension that seemed to characterize their every interaction, and then he moved toward the shelves with a casualness that did not quite mask his purposefulness, withdrawing a volume she recognized as Swift's satirical works. And when he turned to her with a question about whether she had read A Modest Proposal, Eleanor found herself drawn into a conversation that began tentatively but gathered warmth and momentum as they discovered their shared appreciation for wit deployed in service of social criticism. The Duke possessed a dry humor that emerged in unexpected moments, revealing depths beneath his austere exterior, and when Eleanor ventured a comment about preferring Swift's savage clarity to the gentler satire of their own age, she watched something kindle in his expression that might have been delight or recognition, or perhaps relief at finding someone who understood the distinction. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Ashworth," he said after they had debated the merits of various satirists, and there was something in his tone that made her acutely aware they were alone in the library, unchaperoned in a way that would scandalize anyone who knew, yet she could not bring herself to retreat to propriety's demanded distance. "Might I ask how you came to such education? It is uncommon, even among women of higher station." Eleanor felt the familiar shame begin to rise. The story of her fall from modest gentility to paid companion, a wound that had never quite healed, and she deflected with practiced ease, offering vague references to her father's library and her own inclinations toward study. But the Duke's penetrating gaze suggested he heard what she had not said, the losses and disappointments that had brought her to this reduced circumstance, and his next words were spoken with unexpected gentleness. "Whatever path brought you here, Miss Ashworth, it has clearly been one that refined rather than diminished you." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this validation from a man whose opinion should not matter, yet somehow mattered more than she dared acknowledge. Then he made some observation about Pope's translation of Homer that struck her as so wonderfully absurd that she laughed, a genuine sound of mirth that surprised them both, and for one perfect moment they stood in shared amusement, the barriers of rank and circumstance and propriety dissolving in the simple pleasure of intellectual companionship. But then Eleanor saw the Duke's expression shift, saw him remember who he was and who she was, and the impossible gulf between them, and he retreated into formality with such abruptness that she felt the loss like a physical blow. He excused himself with cool courtesy that bore no trace of their earlier warmth, leaving Eleanor alone among the books with her heart racing and her thoughts in chaos, caught between the dangerous, foolish hope that what she had felt in those moments had been real and mutual, and the crushing certainty that she was merely a passing diversion for a man of consequence, that she had allowed herself to dream beyond all reason, and that the awakening from such dreams would leave her more broken than all her previous disappointments combined. 3 days passed in a peculiar suspension of time, where Eleanor found herself caught between the rhythms of her familiar duties and the strange, unprecedented hours spent in the Duke's company, for he had requested her assistance in cataloguing a collection of rare volumes that had belonged to his late father, and though she knew she should have declined, should have insisted that such a task was beyond her purview as Lady Somerset's companion, she found herself unable to refuse when he looked at her with those winter storm eyes that seemed to see past every defense she had carefully constructed over 2 decades of diminishment. They worked side by side in the library each afternoon, the autumn light slanting through the tall windows and casting patterns across the turkey carpet as they examined bindings and compared editions, and gradually, and so gradually that Eleanor could not pinpoint the moment it began, the Duke's formality softened into something that felt dangerously like friendship, his observations moving from purely scholarly to personal, his questions probing gently at the life she had lived and the thoughts she harbored beneath her practiced composure. "I find myself wondering, Miss Ashworth, whether you have always been content in your position," he said one afternoon, as they examined a first edition of Paradise Lost, his voice carrying that quality of genuine curiosity that made deflection seem not just dishonest, but somehow cruel, and Eleanor found herself answering with more truth than she had intended. Speaking of her father's death and the discovery that his estate had been mortgaged beyond recovery, of the choices that had narrowed before her until companion work had seemed not a choice at all, but the only path remaining to a woman without fortune or family or the bloom of youth that might have secured a husband before disaster struck. The Duke listened with an attention that felt like a physical touch, and when she finished her halting recitation, he was silent for a long moment before speaking words that pierced her heart with their unexpected understanding. "Loneliness is a particular kind of prison, is it not? One can be surrounded by people, by consequence and responsibility, by all the trappings that society deems success, and yet feel utterly, profoundly alone." There was something raw in his voice, some pain that matched her own, and Eleanor looked up to find his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen, the austere Duke replaced momentarily by a man who seemed as lost as she felt, and in that moment she understood that his grand life had been no more fulfilling than her reduced circumstances, that privilege could not purchase the companionship of souls, and her heart moved toward him with a compassion that terrified her in its intensity. Then they both reached for the same volume, some treatise on Stoic philosophy, and their hands brushed, the contact sending a shock through Eleanor's entire body that had nothing to do with static, and everything to do with the sudden, visceral awareness of him as a man rather than merely as the Duke, and she pulled back as though burned, stammering some inanity about not meaning to presume, while he too retreated into stiff formality, apologizing for his clumsiness, though they both knew the touch had been accidental and the reaction anything but. The afternoon ended in awkward politeness that could not quite mask the shift that had occurred, and Eleanor fled to her chamber as soon as she could manage, there to berate herself soundly for allowing foolish dreams to take root in soil that could nurture nothing but heartbreak, for imagining that his loneliness might somehow be meant to meet hers, for being, at 40 years of age, as susceptible to romantic delusion as any green girl in her first season. The fragile, tentative understanding that had begun to bloom between Eleanor and the Duke shattered with the arrival of Lady Pemberton 3 days later, her carriage sweeping up the drive with all the imperious authority of one who had never questioned her place in the world's hierarchies, And Eleanor knew from the moment she glimpsed the Duke's sister descending in a flurry of expensive silk and barely concealed disdain that whatever temporary sanctuary she had found in their library conversations was about to be demolished by the harsh intrusion of reality and rank. Lady Pemberton was handsome in the way of women who had never known want or uncertainty, her beauty preserved by comfort and consequence, and she swept through Somerset's halls as though conferring favour by her very presence, her sharp eyes missing nothing and finding much to criticize. Though her sharpest barbs were reserved for Eleanor, whom she encountered in the drawing-room and assessed with the kind of thorough, dismissive appraisal one might give to furnishings of dubious provenance. "So you are the companion my brother has mentioned in his letters," Lady Pemberton said, her tone conveying what her words did not, that Eleanor's very existence was somehow an affront, and when Eleanor curtsied with the deference appropriate to their respective stations, she caught the cruel curve of the other woman's mouth, the satisfaction of one who has confirmed her lowest expectations. How practical of Lady Somerset to employ someone of mature years. I suppose at your age there can be no question of impropriety, no risk of unfortunate complications. The words landed like blows, each one precisely calibrated to remind Eleanor of her unmarriageable state and her faded looks, her fundamental unsuitability for anything beyond the servant's role she occupied. And though Eleanor maintained her composure with the dignity she had learned through years of subtle humiliations, she felt something inside her wither and die, the foolish hope she had barely acknowledged extinguished as thoroughly as a candle in winter wind. At dinner that evening, the Duke's eyes sought hers across the table with an intensity that made her look away, unable to bear the weight of whatever emotion she read there, and when Lady Pemberton made some cutting remark about the tragedy of women who failed to secure husbands in their youth and were thus condemned to dependence, Eleanor felt rather than saw the Duke's hand tighten on his wineglass, his jaw set in a way that suggested barely restrained anger. But his defence of her, when it came, it was so subtle that his sister likely did not even recognize it as such, merely a quiet observation that intelligence and character were virtues that improved with age rather than diminished, unlike the shallow charm society mistakenly prized. Eleanor excused herself as soon as propriety permitted, retreating to her small chamber where she belonged, where the pretense of being anything other than a paid dependent could be abandoned. But even there she could not escape, for later that evening she descended to retrieve a book she had left in the library and heard voices in the drawing-room. Lady Pemberton's carrying clearly through the partially open door as she detailed her plans to introduce the Duke to several suitable young ladies upon their return to London, women of proper breeding and fortune and, she emphasized with particular venom, women in the first bloom of youth who could give him heirs and grace his position as a Duchess should. "This peculiar isolation has clearly affected your judgment, brother," Lady Pemberton declared, "but I shall remedy that swiftly enough. Miss Hartley is particularly lovely, only 22, with a dowry of £30,000, and the Waverley girl, though not quite as well favoured, has impeccable connections. You cannot continue this, in whatever this is, with that aging companion. It is beneath you." Eleanor did not wait to hear the Duke's response, could not bear to hear whether he would defend her again, or whether his sister's words would remind him of the impossibility of what could never be, and she fled back to her chamber with her heart breaking and her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed, reality reasserting itself with all the cruelty of truth after beautiful delusion, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever she had imagined growing between them had been nothing more than her own desperate fantasy, that the Duke would return to his world of consequence and suitable matches, and she would remain exactly what she had always been, invisible, unmarriageable, a woman whose season had passed long ago, if indeed it had ever arrived at all. Eleanor could not bear the house after that evening, could not endure the weight of Lady Pemberton's presence, or the careful distance the Duke now maintained in his sister's company, and so she fled to the gardens as twilight descended, seeking solace in the autumn air that carried the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, wrapping her shawl tightly against the chill that seemed to emanate as much from her own heart as from the darkening sky. And it was there, in the shelter of the old arbour, where roses had long since finished blooming, that she found him standing alone with his back to her, his shoulders rigid with some tension she could read even from a distance, and she nearly turned away, nearly retreated to preserve the proper distance that his sister's arrival had so brutally reimposed. But something in his solitary figure stopped her, some echo of the loneliness he had confessed in the library that called to her own isolation, and she found herself walking toward him, despite every instinct of self-preservation. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and in the fading light she saw his face stripped of its usual austere composure, saw something raw and wounded in his expression that made her forget propriety and position, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with barely suppressed emotion, as he said, "Forgive me, Miss Ashworth. I find I am poor company this evening." But he made no move to leave, and Eleanor, emboldened by the intimacy of dusk and desperation, remained where she was, searching for words that might ease whatever pain she witnessed without overstepping the bounds that separated their worlds. "My late wife," he began abruptly, the words seeming to tear from him against his will, "was chosen for me when I was 26, selected by my father for her impeccable lineage and substantial fortune, and I performed my duty as was expected, wed her with all proper ceremony, installed her as Duchess of Thornwood, and for 15 years we lived in the same house, shared the same table, appeared together at society's demands, and yet we were strangers until the day she died, perfect strangers, executing the performance of marriage without ever touching the reality of connection, and I thought that was simply what marriage was, what all marriages must be, this careful dance of obligation and emptiness." Eleanor's heart contracted with compassion for the bleakness in his voice, for the waste of years spent in proximity without intimacy, and she moved closer, drawn by instinct to offer whatever comfort her presence might provide. And when she spoke, her words carried no judgment, only gentle understanding born of her own years of loneliness and loss. "You cannot fault yourself for a circumstance arranged by others," she said softly, "nor for failing to create warmth where none was planted." And the Duke turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers in the gathering darkness with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have never known genuine companionship," he confessed, and there was something almost desperate in his admission, as though the words had been locked inside him for years and could no longer be contained. Never experienced the meeting of minds and hearts that poets write of, never imagined it was even possible until he stopped. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty what he had been about to say, could feel the unspoken words hanging between them like a physical presence, and the air seemed to thicken with all the impossible things neither of them could acknowledge, with the growing intimacy that defied every rule of rank and propriety. They stood mere inches apart now, close enough that Eleanor could see the pulse beating at his throat, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool evening air, and when he lifted his hand as though to touch her face, she swayed toward him like a plant towards sunlight, helpless against the pull of connection she had never expected to feel. But before contact could be made, the sound of voices drifted from the house, servants calling for the Duke to attend some matter that required his attention, and reality crashed back with all its crushing weight as they stepped apart, the Duke's hand falling to his side, and Eleanor turning away to hide the tears that threatened to spill, both of them retreating into the safety of distance and formality. Even as something inside Eleanor broke apart, hope warring with reason, and reason winning because it must, because dreams were for young girls, and she was 40 years old, and should know better than to imagine that a Duke's moment of vulnerability meant anything more than temporary loneliness, seeking temporary comfort, even as her traitorous heart whispered that what she had witnessed in his eyes was something far deeper, far more dangerous, far more impossible than she dared believe. A week had elapsed since that charged evening in the garden, and the household at Somerset had settled into a strange, tense rhythm of avoidance and awareness, with Eleanor retreating into the shadows of her proper role, while the Duke moved through the halls with barely suppressed frustration that everyone could sense but none dared acknowledge, until the morning Lady Somerset appeared at breakfast, looking remarkably restored, her illness having passed with the kind of convenient timing that made Eleanor suspect the Dowager had been far less incapacitated than she had allowed everyone to believe, and with Lady Somerset's recovery came the inevitable conclusion to Eleanor's brief, impossible tenure as hostess, the return to her rightful place in the household's hierarchy, and the Duke's announcement, delivered over breakfast with careful formality, that he must return to London within 2 days to attend to matters that could no longer be postponed. Eleanor felt the words like a physical blow, though she kept her face composed and her hands steady as she poured Lady Somerset's tea, playing the invisible servant so thoroughly that one might think she had never presided over these very rooms, had never sat at this table, engaging in intellectual discourse with a duke who looked at her as though she mattered, and she told herself this was proper, this was right. This was the natural order reasserting itself after a strange interlude that should never have occurred, yet something in her chest felt crushed and broken beyond repair. The final evening arrived with the cruel swiftness of all endings, and Lady Somerset had arranged a formal dinner with several families from the surrounding estates, local gentry who came to pay their respects to the Duke and who treated Eleanor with the casual dismissiveness reserved for paid companions, speaking around her and through her as though she were merely another piece of furniture in the room, and she resumed her accustomed invisibility with a grace born of long practice, sitting at the far end of the table near Lady Somerset, fetching the dowager's shawl when requested, offering her arm when the older woman rose, performing all the small services that defined her existence, while the Duke held court among his social equals and pretended, with varying degrees of success, that he did not notice Eleanor's relegation to servant status. Yet Eleanor felt his eyes on her throughout the interminable meal, felt the weight of his gaze like a touch across the crowded table, and when she dared to glance up, she saw such barely concealed displeasure in his expression that she had to look away, unable to bear the evidence that perhaps, impossibly, he minded this restoration of proper distance as much as she did, though what good such minding could do when the world's hierarchies were immutable and she was 40 years old, with neither fortune nor beauty nor youth to recommend her to a duke's consideration. The evening ended with painful formality, the Duke bidding good night to Lady Somerset and her guests with impeccable courtesy, and when his eyes met Eleanor's across the drawing-room, there passed between them something so charged and desperate and unspoken that she felt tears threaten, and she curtsied with downcast eyes, murmuring the proper words of gratitude for his visit, while he stood frozen for a moment that stretched into eternity before inclining his head in acknowledgement and turning away. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow he would depart and she would never see him again, that whatever had briefly flickered between them would be extinguished by distance and duty and the insurmountable reality of their different stations. And she retreated to her chamber that night, knowing that she had been foolish beyond measure to allow herself even a moment's hope, even a heartbeat's belief that a man like the Duke of Thornwood could ever see a woman like her as anything more than a temporary convenience, a brief respite from loneliness that meant nothing in the harsh light of society's expectations and his own responsibilities to his rank. The morning of the Duke's departure dawned cold and misty, the kind of grey November day that seemed to leach all colour from the world and leave only muted tones of loss and ending, and Eleanor dressed with mechanical precision in her sombre companion's garb, her fingers steady as she pinned her hair, though her heart felt like shattered glass inside her chest, and she descended to the entrance hall, where the household had gathered to bid farewell to their distinguished guest, maintaining the composure that years of service had taught her, even as everything within her screamed against this inevitable parting. The Duke emerged from the breakfast room in his travelling clothes, every inch the powerful nobleman, his face arranged in the austere mask he wore for the world, and he thanked Lady Somerset with perfect formality for her hospitality, acknowledged the assembled servants with appropriate graciousness, and then his eyes found Eleanor's across the crowded hall, and something flickered in their depths, something desperate and reluctant that made her breath catch, even as she curtsied with downcast gaze, playing her role to perfection because that was all she had left now, all she could control when her heart was breaking. He approached her last, and the household fell silent as though sensing some tension they could not name, and when he took her hand to bid farewell, his fingers lingered on hers for a moment too long, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a caress so slight that anyone watching might have imagined it, and his voice when he spoke was rough with suppressed emotion as he said, "Thank you, Miss Ashworth, and for your invaluable assistance during my stay. You have been most gracious, and I shall not forget your kindness." And the formal words meant nothing while his eyes said everything, speaking of regret and longing and impossible desires that could never be acknowledged in this public space. Eleanor murmured something appropriate in response, though she could not later recall what words she had used, conscious only of his hand warm around hers, and the knowledge that in moments he would release her and walk away, and she would never again feel this connection, this recognition, this devastating sense of being truly seen by another soul. And then he did release her, stepping back with visible reluctance, and she watched as he climbed into his elegant carriage, watched as the door closed and the horses moved forward, watched until the vehicle disappeared down the long drive into the mist, becoming first a shadow and then nothing at all. And only when it had vanished completely did she allow herself to breathe, to feel, to acknowledge the grief that crashed over her like a wave, threatening to drag her under. The household dispersed to their duties, and Eleanor retreated to her small chamber under the eaves, the room that had been her refuge for years and now felt like a prison. And there, finally alone, she collapsed into the chair by her narrow window and wept with a violence that frightened her, great tearing sobs that seemed to come from someplace deeper than her lungs, mourning not just the Duke's departure but the death of hope itself, the end of that brief, brilliant interlude, when she had been foolish enough to imagine that a woman of 40 with nothing to recommend her could matter to a man of such consequence, and she told herself savagely that this was the price of allowing dreams to take root. This was what came of forgetting one's place and reaching for things forever beyond one's grasp. The weeks that followed passed in a grey melancholy that settled over Eleanor like fog, and she resumed her invisible existence with a thoroughness that made the household servants comment among themselves that Miss Ashworth seemed even quieter than usual, even more withdrawn, and she performed her duties with mechanical efficiency while feeling nothing, caring for Lady Somerset with practiced competence while her own heart remained frozen. And the autumn deepened into winter, and Eleanor told herself this was simply life. This return to emptiness was the natural state of things, and the fortnight with the Duke had been an aberration, a strange dream from which she had finally, painfully, awakened to cold reality. 3 weeks later, Eleanor was performing her usual morning duties in Lady Somerset's chambers, arranging the Dowager's correspondence and preparing her breakfast tray, when the butler arrived with the post, and among the usual letters lay one bearing the Duke of Thornwood's seal, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down the teapot, her heart beginning a painful hammering in her chest, though she told herself sternly that the letter surely concerned some matter of estate business or social pleasantry that had nothing whatsoever to do with her. Lady Somerset opened the letter with maddening slowness, while Eleanor pretended to busy herself with straightening the already straight curtains, and then the Dowager made a small sound of interest that caused Eleanor to turn despite herself, and she found Lady Somerset regarding her with an expression of such knowing amusement that Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks even before the older woman spoke. "My dear Eleanor," Lady Somerset said, her eyes twinkling with suppressed delight, "it seems the Duke of Thornwood has written with a most particular request. He asks if I might spare you to travel to London to serve as companion to his young niece, Lady Catherine, who has recently come to live with him and requires the guidance of a refined and educated woman, and he speaks most highly of your character and accomplishments and suggests that you would be ideally suited to the role." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. They felt her carefully reconstructed composure crack and splinter as hope and terror warred within her chest, and she heard herself saying in a voice that sounded distant and strange, "Surely your ladyship cannot spare me. My duties here are too essential," even as her treacherous heart sang at the possibility of seeing him again, of being near him, even in the proper and distant relationship of employer and companion. Lady Somerset set down the letter and regarded Eleanor with an expression of gentle understanding that suggested the Dowager saw far more than Eleanor had ever intended to reveal, and she said softly, "My dear child, I have not been so ill-served by age that I cannot recognize what passed between you and His Grace during his visit, and I think perhaps it is time you allowed yourself the possibility of happiness rather than hiding forever in the shadows of my household." Eleanor felt tears threaten at the kindness in the older woman's voice, and she protested weakly about propriety and the impossibility of the situation and her own unsuitability, all the arguments she had repeated to herself during the long grey weeks since the Duke's departure. But Lady Somerset waved these objections away with an impatient gesture and said firmly, "You will accept this position, Eleanor, because life is too short to refuse every opportunity for joy out of fear, and because the Duke of Thornwood is not a man who makes frivolous requests, and because I have grown fond enough of you these past years to wish to see you live rather than merely exist. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the room, her mind racing through 1,000 considerations and objections and terrors. The impropriety of going to London to live in the Duke's household, even as companion to his niece, and the whispers and speculation that would inevitably follow, the agony of being near him while maintaining proper distance. Yet beneath all these fears ran a current of desperate longing that she could no longer deny, a yearning to see his face again, to hear his voice, to exist once more in that charged atmosphere where she felt truly alive. And she thought of his hand lingering on hers at parting, thought of the way he had looked at her across that final dinner table, and she found herself saying in a whisper, "I will accept, if your ladyship believes it proper." And Lady Somerset smiled with such satisfaction that Eleanor suspected the Dowager had been entirely complicit in this arrangement from the beginning, had perhaps even encouraged the Duke's request. And as Eleanor returned to her chamber to compose her acceptance, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that might have been courage or might have been the first tentative return of hope. Eleanor's journey to London took 2 days in the Duke's own carriage, which he had sent for her comfort, a consideration that both touched and terrified her as she watched the familiar Somerset countryside give way to villages and market towns, and finally to the sprawling vastness of the capital itself. And with each passing mile she felt her courage wavering, even as something within her quickened with anticipation at the prospect of seeing him again, of existing once more in his presence, though she reminded herself sternly that she was coming as companion to his niece, nothing more, a position of service, however elevated it might be from her previous circumstances. The Mayfair townhouse that rose before her, as the carriage drew to a halt, exceeded anything Eleanor had imagined in its elegant proportions and imposing facade, its windows gleaming in the pale December sunlight, and as liveried footmen descended to assist her from the carriage, she felt acutely conscious of her plain travelling dress and modest luggage, felt herself shrinking back into the invisibility that had been her protection for so many years. Yet the butler who greeted her at the door treated her with a deference that suggested the Duke had given explicit instructions about her reception, addressing her as Miss Ashworth with a respect usually reserved for family connections rather than mere companions. She was shown to a suite of rooms on the second floor that made her breath catch with their unexpected luxury. A sitting room and bedchamber decorated in soft blues and creams, with a view over the square's private gardens, quarters far finer than any she had occupied in her life. And as she removed her bonnet with trembling hands, she wondered what this generosity meant, whether it signified the Duke's genuine regard or merely his aristocratic sense of proper hospitality. And she had barely begun to unpack when a light knock sounded at her door, and a young woman swept in without waiting for permission, all dark curls and sparkling eyes and irrepressible energy. "Miss Ashworth, I am so delighted you have come. I am Catherine, and Uncle has told me so much about you that I feel we are already friends," the girl declared, and Eleanor found herself embraced with an enthusiasm that left her momentarily speechless. And as she looked into Lady Catherine's intelligent face, she saw a perceptiveness there that suggested the 17-year-old understood far more than her youth might indicate, saw a knowing sparkle in those eyes that made Eleanor wonder exactly what the Duke had revealed about their acquaintance. Catherine chatted cheerfully as she helped Eleanor arrange her things, asking questions about Somerset and books and 1,000 other topics with genuine interest. And Eleanor felt herself relaxing in the girl's warm presence, felt the terrible tension that had gripped her since accepting this position beginning to ease. And when Catherine took her arm to lead her downstairs for tea, she felt almost optimistic about this strange new chapter of her life, at least until they reached the drawing room, and she saw the Duke standing by the fireplace, and then all her carefully constructed composure threatened to shatter at the sight of him. He turned as they entered, and for one unguarded moment his face revealed everything, joy and relief and longing so naked that Eleanor felt her knees weaken. But then the ducal mask descended, and he was bowing formally and saying in that deep voice that haunted her dreams, "Miss Ashworth, welcome to my home. I trust your journey was comfortable." And Eleanor curtsied and murmured appropriate responses, while her heart hammered so loudly she was certain he must hear it. And they sat to tea with Catherine chattering between them, and throughout the meal Eleanor felt the Duke's eyes upon her, felt his gaze like a physical touch, even when she kept her own eyes carefully downcast. And when at last dinner was announced, and he offered his arm to escort both ladies to the dining room, his hand closed over hers with a pressure that spoke volumes in its silent intensity, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that the next weeks would test every ounce of restraint she possessed, for being near him and maintaining proper distance would be the sweetest and most exquisite torture she had ever endured. Eleanor's first venture into London society came 4 days after her arrival, when the Duke insisted that both she and Catherine attend a musicale at the home of the Countess of Hartwick, a formidable matron whose approval could make or break a young woman's season, and Eleanor had protested that it would be more appropriate for her to remain at home while Catherine made her debut under the Duke's escort. But he had looked at her with such intensity and said, "I wish for your company, Miss Ashworth, and I will hear no argument on the matter," in a tone that brooked no disagreement, and so she found herself in the Countess's glittering drawing-room, dressed in a gown of deep plum silk that Catherine had insisted she purchase, feeling acutely conscious of being the oldest woman present who was not either married or a chaperone in an official capacity. The whispers began almost immediately. She heard them rippling through the assembled guests like wind through autumn leaves, the turned heads and raised fans, and barely concealed stares, and though she kept her face composed and her posture erect, she felt each whispered speculation like a physical blow, heard the cutting remarks that the speakers made no real effort to conceal from her hearing. Can you imagine the Duke bringing his niece's companion to the Hartwick musicale as though she were a guest of consequence? One matron said to her companion in a voice pitched to carry, and at her age, one would think she would have the decency to remain invisible, as befits her station. And another responded with malicious sweetness, "Perhaps the poor man does not realize how it appears. He has been so long without a wife that he has forgotten the proprieties, though surely someone should inform him that he needs fresh blood in his household, not some faded spinster companion." Eleanor felt the color drain from her face and then flood back in a wave of humiliation, felt her hands tremble as she gripped her fan more tightly, but she held her head high and smiled at Catherine, who stood beside her looking furious on her behalf, and she murmured quietly, "Pay them no mind, my dear. Let us find our seats for the performance." Though inside she felt something breaking, felt the fragile hope she had allowed herself beginning to crumble beneath the weight of society's cruel judgment. The Duke had been across the room speaking with several gentlemen when Eleanor and Catherine entered, but she saw the precise moment when he became aware of the whispers and the stares, saw his expression transform from polite attention to something dark and dangerous, and he excused himself from his companions and crossed the room with such deliberate purpose that conversations faltered in his wake, and when he reached Eleanor's side, he took her hand and placed it on his arm with a possessiveness that sent shocked murmurs through the assembled company, and he looked at her with such tenderness that she felt tears threaten despite her determination to maintain composure. "You look pale, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, though his eyes swept the room with unmistakable warning. "Would you care to take some air in the conservatory before the music begins?" And Eleanor nodded mutely, allowing him to escort her from the drawing-room, while she felt the weight of dozens of scandalized stares following their departure, and once they reached the relative privacy of the conservatory with its towering palms and exotic blooms, he turned to her and said with barely controlled fury, "I saw their faces, I heard their poison, and I will not tolerate such treatment of you." And Eleanor found herself saying brokenly, "They are right, Your Grace. I should not be here. My presence compromises your position and Catherine's prospects. I was foolish to accept your invitation to London." But he gripped her hands and said with fierce intensity, "They know nothing of true worth, Eleanor. They measure value in youth and fortune and connections, but they are blind to character and intelligence and the rare beauty of a soul that has been refined by time and experience. And I will not allow their narrow cruelty to diminish what I have found in you." Catherine proved herself a delightfully perceptive romantic conspirator in the days following the musicale, for the young woman had observed with those sharp 17-year-old eyes the way her uncle looked at Eleanor when he thought himself unobserved, had noticed how his entire countenance transformed when Eleanor entered a room, how his gaze sought her out during dinner and lingered on her face when she was engaged in conversation, and Catherine had also witnessed Eleanor's careful restraint, the way she held herself apart, despite the longing that sometimes flickered in her eyes before she ruthlessly suppressed it, and the girl had apparently decided that these two people who were so obviously suited for one another simply needed gentle encouragement to overcome the absurd barriers that society and their own fears had erected between them. It began with small machinations, Catherine claiming fatigue or a headache at strategic moments so that Eleanor and the Duke would be left alone in the drawing room after dinner, or Catherine suddenly remembering an urgent letter she must write, just as they were all settling in the library for an evening of reading. And Eleanor recognized the girl's transparent schemes, but found herself grateful for them, even as propriety demanded she protest. For those stolen hours alone with the Duke became the moments she treasured most, when they could speak freely about books and philosophy and the state of the world, when his formality would gradually dissolve and she would glimpse the man beneath the ducal reserve, lonely and hungry for genuine connection. The most memorable of Catherine's interventions came when she proposed an educational excursion to the British Museum, claiming a passionate interest in antiquities that Eleanor suspected was entirely fabricated, and when they arrived at the great building, Catherine developed a sudden fascination with Egyptian artifacts in a gallery, quite separate from the one housing the Elgin marbles, where Eleanor and the Duke found themselves alone among the ancient Greek sculptures. And there, in that cavernous space filled with the silent beauty of centuries-old art, they walked slowly together discussing the merits of classical versus romantic aesthetics, and the Duke spoke with an animation Eleanor had rarely witnessed in him, his usual guardedness falling away as he gestured toward the friezes and explained his theories about the relationship between art and truth, and she found herself responding with equal passion, their conversation flowing with the ease of long friendship, and at one point he stopped before a sculpture of two figures in eternal embrace and said quietly, "I find myself seeking your opinion on all matters, Eleanor. I realize that I have come to rely upon your wisdom and perspective in ways I never anticipated, and the thought of making any significant decision without first knowing your thoughts feels impossible to me now." And she looked up at him with her heart in her throat, seeing in his eyes something that went far beyond mere intellectual appreciation, something that made her breath catch and her careful defenses tremble. They had lingered so long at the museum that Catherine eventually came to find them, and on the carriage ride home the girl had looked between them with such knowing satisfaction that Eleanor felt herself blushing like a young woman. And that evening, when Catherine helped her dress for dinner, the young woman had said with startling directness, "You care for him, do you not, Miss Ashworth? And he most certainly cares for you. I have never seen my uncle so alive as he has been these past weeks." And Eleanor had begun to protest about propriety and the impossibility of such a connection. But Catherine had taken her hands and said with a wisdom beyond her years, "Age is but a number when hearts align, Miss Ashworth. My uncle has lived 45 years and has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you. And you deserve to be happy after spending so many years invisible and undervalued. And I think perhaps you are both precisely what the other needs." And though Eleanor shook her head and murmured that Catherine was a romantic girl, seeing what she wished to see, something in her heart had shifted at those words, some last barrier of resistance beginning to crack, and she allowed herself for the first time to contemplate the tremulous hope that perhaps love might not be entirely beyond her reach after all. The evening at the theatre arrived with all the glittering promise of London's social season, for the Duke had secured his private box at Covent Garden for a performance of Mozart's Don Giovanni, and Eleanor had dressed with particular care in a gown of sapphire silk that Catherine had insisted brought out the depth of her eyes, though as their carriage rattled through the lamplit streets, Eleanor felt the familiar anxiety rising in her chest at the prospect of being displayed before society's scrutinizing gaze. Yet when they arrived and the Duke handed her from the carriage with such careful attention, his fingers lingering on hers longer than propriety demanded, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, or perhaps simply the dangerous intoxication of being seen as something more than invisible. The theatre blazed with candlelight and the rustle of silk and the mingled scents of perfume and wax, and as they made their way to the Duke's box, Eleanor was acutely conscious of the heads turning, the fans snapping open to shield whispered observations, the raised eyebrows and knowing looks, but the Duke kept her hand firmly on his arm and guided her with such proprietary care that she found herself able to lift her chin and meet those stares with dignity, and once they were settled in the privacy of the box with its crimson velvet curtains and gilded chairs, she felt herself relax slightly as the orchestra began to tune their instruments. The opera commenced with all its dramatic splendor, but Eleanor found herself less absorbed in the performance than in the man beside her. For the Duke had shifted his chair infinitesimally closer to hers so that their shoulders nearly touched, and somewhere during the first act she felt his hand find hers in the darkness between their seats, his fingers threading through hers with such tender certainty that her breath caught and her heart began to race, and she sat there in the shadows of the box, acutely conscious of that single point of contact, of the warmth of his palm against hers, of the way his thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand as though he could not help himself, and she thought that no music could be sweeter than this silent communication between them, this acknowledgement of something too profound for words. The spell shattered during the intermission when Lady Pemberton appeared at their box, accompanied by two young women of such ethereal beauty and obvious wealth that Eleanor felt her heart sink, for the Duke's sister swept in with imperious purpose and said in a voice that carried to the neighboring boxes, "Alexander, how fortuitous that I should find you here. You must meet Lady Arabella Winthrop and Miss Cecilia Hartstone, two of the season's most accomplished young ladies, and I have taken the liberty of inviting them to join us for the second act." And the young women simpered and curtsied, while Lady Pemberton pointedly ignored Eleanor's presence as though she were merely part of the furnishings, and Eleanor began to withdraw her hand from the Duke's and rise to make room, assuming she would be expected to yield her place to these glittering creatures who represented everything society deemed appropriate for a Duke's consideration. But the Duke's hand tightened on hers, holding her in place, and he rose with such cold formality that the temperature in the box seemed to drop, and he said in a voice of ice and absolute authority, "Lady Pemberton, you presume too much. I have not invited additional guests to my box this evening, and I must ask you to take your companions elsewhere, for Miss Ashworth and my niece are my chosen company tonight, and I require no other." And Lady Pemberton's face flushed with outrage, while the two young women looked between the Duke and Eleanor with dawning comprehension and poorly concealed disdain, and the Duke added with deliberate emphasis, "Miss Ashworth is my honored guest, and I will thank you to remember that in future." And though his sister sputtered protests about propriety and his position, he simply turned away from her and resumed his seat beside Eleanor, taking her hand once more with such possessive tenderness that gasps rippled through the nearby boxes where this little drama had been witnessed with avid interest. And Eleanor sat frozen in horror and wonder, knowing that he had just made a public declaration that would set all of London ablaze with scandal, terrified that she had caused irreparable damage to his reputation, yet unable to deny the fierce joy that flooded through her at his choosing her so publicly over society's expectations. Eleanor returned to the townhouse that night with her mind in utter turmoil, for the Duke's public declaration had ignited a firestorm of scandal that she knew would only grow more vicious with each passing hour, and as she lay sleepless in her chamber, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling, she could hear in her imagination all the cruel whispers that would be circulating through London's drawing rooms by morning, the speculation about what arts she must have employed to ensnare a duke, the vicious assertions that a woman of 40 had no business aspiring to such a match, the predictions of his inevitable regret when he came to his senses and realized what damage her presence did to his consequence, and though her heart soared at the memory of his hand, holding hers so tenderly in the darkness, at the way he had defended her before his sister and all of society, she knew with cold certainty that she could not allow him to sacrifice his reputation and position for her sake, for what was her happiness compared to the ruin she would bring upon him? What were her foolish dreams measured against the reality of a duke's responsibilities and the expectations of his station? By the time the first grey light of dawn crept through her windows, Eleanor had made her decision, and with hands that trembled only slightly, she began to pack her belongings with methodical precision, folding each garment carefully and placing her few possessions into the worn travelling case that had accompanied her through so many years of quiet service, and as she worked, she composed in her mind the letter she would write to him, the words that would explain why she must leave even though her heart was breaking, why she could not be the cause of scandal that would taint his name and damage his standing among his peers, why loving him meant setting him free to make a suitable match with some young woman of impeccable breeding who would bring him alliance and heirs and the approval of society, rather than whispers and shame. She was sealing the letter with wax when Catherine burst into her chamber without knocking. The young woman still in her nightdress with her hair tumbling loose about her shoulders, and Catherine's eyes went immediately to the packed case and the letter on the writing desk, and she cried out, "No, Miss Ashworth, you cannot mean to leave. Not now, when my uncle has finally found the courage to declare himself. Not when I have seen him happier these past weeks than I have ever known him to be." But Eleanor shook her head and said gently, "Dear Catherine, you are young and romantic, and you do not understand the realities of the world. I cannot allow the Duke to ruin himself for my sake. Society will never accept this match, and he will come to resent me for the damage I have done to his reputation." And Catherine grasped her hands with surprising strength and said urgently, "You must speak with him before you go. You owe him that much at least. He deserves to know why you are abandoning him when he has risked everything to claim you publicly." And Eleanor was shaking her head and reaching for her case when heavy footsteps sounded in the corridor, and the Duke himself appeared in the doorway, still in his evening clothes from the night before, as though he had not slept at all. And Catherine must have sent word to him the moment she discovered Eleanor's intention to flee, and Eleanor found herself backing toward the window as tears began to stream down her face, and she said brokenly, "Your Grace, I cannot stay. Last night you made yourself the subject of scandal on my account, and I will not allow it to continue. I am 40 years old, and past any hope of marriage and society, will never forgive you for choosing me over the young women they deem appropriate, and I cannot bear to watch your reputation crumble because of my presence in your life." But the Duke crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her face between his hands with such tenderness that her breath caught, and he said in a voice rough with emotion, "You speak of age as though it diminishes you, Eleanor, but it has refined you into everything I never knew I needed. It has given you wisdom and compassion and a depth of understanding that no young woman, fresh from the schoolroom, could possibly possess. And if society cannot see your worth, then society be damned, for I will not lose you to their arbitrary judgments and cruel expectations." Eleanor stood trembling before him with tears streaming down her face as the Duke's hands cradled her cheeks with such exquisite gentleness. And then, to her utter astonishment, he released her and slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to one knee before her in that modest bedchamber, with Catherine watching wide-eyed from the doorway, and he took Eleanor's hands in his own and looked up at her with such raw vulnerability that her breath stopped in her chest, for here was one of England's most powerful peers kneeling before a penniless companion as though she were a queen, and he said in a voice that shook with the force of emotion too long contained, "Eleanor Ashworth, I have lived 45 years on this earth and never understood what it meant to truly see another person until I met you. Never knew that companionship could exist between a man and woman until those days in the library at Somerset, when you spoke to me, not as a duke, but as a man. Never comprehended that love could be built on mutual respect and shared understanding, rather than mere duty or fleeting passion." And Eleanor tried to speak, to protest, but he squeezed her hands and continued with desperate urgency, "I have loved you since those first days, though I was too much a coward to acknowledge it even to myself. Loved the way you moved through rooms with quiet grace, as though afraid to take up space in the world when you deserved to command it. Loved your intelligence, that you tried to hide behind deference. Loved the kindness in your eyes when you thought no one was watching. Loved the way you listened, as though what I said truly mattered. And I have been half alive all these weeks, trying to find the courage to speak what my heart has known with absolute certainty." He drew a shaking breath, and Eleanor saw tears glittering in his own eyes as he said the words that would alter the course of her entire existence. "Marry me, Eleanor, not despite your years, but because of them, because you understand life and loss and the courage it takes to hope again when hope has been disappointed. Because you have lived enough to know the value of genuine connection, because your soul has been refined by experience into something infinitely more precious than the shallow beauty of youth that fades with time. Marry me because I cannot imagine facing another day without you beside me, because when I look at you I see not what society deems appropriate, but everything I have ever needed and never known I was searching for." Eleanor stood paralyzed between disbelief and desperate longing as she stammered, "Your Grace, Alexander, you cannot possibly mean this. I am 40 years old with no fortune and no beauty and no prospects. I will bring you nothing but scandal and whispers and the disapproval of everyone who matters in your world. Your sister already despises me, and society will never accept a match so unequal. You could have any woman in England, young and beautiful and wealthy, women who would bring you alliance and heirs and the approval of the ton. Why would you sacrifice all of that for someone like me? But the Duke rose to his feet without releasing her hands and said with fierce certainty, "Let society whisper, let my sister rage, and let the entire world disapprove. I care nothing for their judgments. When weighed against the reality of what I feel for you, you speak of bringing me nothing when you have already given me everything that truly matters. You have shown me what it means to be valued for myself rather than my title. You have taught me that genuine partnership is worth more than all the advantageous alliances in Christendom. And as for heirs, I have nephews aplenty to inherit my estates. What I need is not another generation to carry my name, but a companion to share whatever years remain to me." And he cupped her face once more and said with desperate tenderness, "Give me your answer, Eleanor, not what society would demand, but what your heart knows to be true. Do you love me as I love you? Can you find the courage to accept what I offer despite the obstacles? Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are worthy of every devotion I possess?" And Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw reflected there all the loneliness and longing that echoed her own, all the years of existing rather than living, all the quiet desperation of hearts that had given up hope of being truly known. And she felt something break open inside her chest, some wall she had built around her heart to protect it from disappointment, and through her tears she whispered the single word that would transform everything: "Yes." The announcement appeared in the Times the following morning, in the usual place reserved for matters of consequence among the aristocracy. A simple notice that Alexander Hartley, Duke of Thornwood, had the honour of announcing his betrothal to Miss Eleanor Ashworth of Somerset. And by noon, London society had erupted into a frenzy of scandal and gossip, the likes of which had not been seen in a decade, for drawing rooms across Mayfair buzzed with vicious speculation about what possible inducement could have led a duke to choose a penniless companion of 40 years over the countless young beauties who had been angling for his attention. And Eleanor sat in the morning room of the townhouse, with her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the sounds of carriage after carriage, arriving as callers descended upon them with barely concealed curiosity and thinly veiled disapproval, and she felt her courage wavering as she imagined the cutting remarks that would be directed at her, the pitying glances, the whispered assertions that she had somehow trapped him through arts best left unspoken. But the Duke sat beside her with his hand covering hers in full view of every caller who entered, and when Lady Pemberton arrived with a delegation of matrons clearly intent on persuading him to reconsider this disastrous alliance, he stood and faced them with such cold hauteur that even his formidable sister took an involuntary step backward. And he said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "I will say this once, and once only, so that there can be no misunderstanding. Miss Ashworth has done me the extraordinary honour of accepting my proposal of marriage, and anyone who cannot show her the respect due to the future Duchess of Thornwood is no longer welcome in this house or in my life." And the silence that followed his pronouncement was profound and terrible until it was broken by an unexpected voice. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford, a woman of 70 whose word carried weight even among the highest circles, stepped forward and said with crystalline clarity, "Your Grace, I applaud your excellent judgment, for I have known Miss Ashworth these many years through my friendship with Lady Somerset, and I can attest that she possesses intelligence, grace, and character in far greater measure than most of the simpering misses currently cluttering London's ballrooms, and any man wise enough to value substance over fleeting beauty is to be commended." And she turned to Eleanor and took her hands and said warmly, "My dear, you will make a splendid Duchess, and I look forward to calling upon you in that capacity." And gradually, hesitantly, other older women who had grown weary of society's shallow obsessions began to voice their support. These women who had lived long enough to understand that true partnership mattered more than adherence to arbitrary rules about appropriate ages for marriage. And though the younger matrons remained disapproving and the gossip continued to swirl through the ton like poison, Eleanor began to understand that they would weather this storm because they would face it together. Their first public appearance as a betrothed couple came 3 nights later at the Bellingham ball, and Eleanor dressed with trembling hands in a gown of deep sapphire silk that the Duke had insisted upon commissioning for her, and when she descended the stairs to find him waiting in the entrance hall, he looked at her with such open admiration that she felt for the first time in her life truly beautiful, and he offered her his arm and said quietly, "Let them stare, let them whisper. I want all of London to see the extraordinary woman who has agreed to be my wife." And they entered the ballroom together to a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the rustling of her own silk skirts, and then the whispers began like wind through dry leaves. But the Duke led her directly to the center of the floor and claimed the first waltz with such possessive pride that there could be no mistaking his devotion, and as they moved together through the elegant patterns of the dance, Eleanor saw the whispers slowly shift from outright scandal towards something that might eventually become reluctant acceptance, for even the most rigid adherence to social convention could not entirely dismiss the obvious depth of feeling between them, and when the Duke's powerful friends and political allies began to publicly endorse the match and request introductions to his intended bride, society began gradually to understand that this was not a passing fancy or a moment of madness, but a genuine love match that would not be swayed by disapproval, and Eleanor felt the iron bands of fear that had constricted her chest since that morning's announcement begin, slowly, tentatively, to loosen their grip. As autumn arrived and the leaves began their transformation into copper and gold, Eleanor found herself caught up in preparations for a wedding that seemed to exist in some dreamlike realm, far removed from the stark realities she had always known. For the Duke had insisted upon an intimate ceremony rather than the grand society spectacle that his position might have demanded, and she understood this choice as yet another gift, his recognition that she would be more comfortable, surrounded by genuine well-wishers rather than curious strangers, come to gawk at the scandalous match. And so the planning proceeded with quiet joy in the townhouse, where Catherine threw herself into every detail with the enthusiasm of a young woman, orchestrating her first romantic triumph. Eleanor submitted to endless fittings for her wedding gown, standing patient and still, while the modiste pinned and adjusted the cream silk that draped her figure with elegant simplicity, and she caught glimpses of herself in the looking-glass and felt a strange disconnect between the woman she saw reflected there, this woman with color in her cheeks and light in her eyes, and the resigned spinster she had been such a short time ago. And the Duke seemed to sense these moments of disbelief, for he made it his mission to court her with such deliberate tenderness that she could not doubt the reality of what was happening, sending her flowers each morning with notes written in his own hand, quoting poetry that spoke of enduring love rather than fleeting passion, stealing moments alone with her in the library where their connection had first begun to arrange books they would never read, while his fingers found excuses to brush against hers, walking with her in the small garden behind the townhouse, in the golden afternoon light, while he spoke of his estate in Derbyshire, where they would spend much of their time, and asked her opinions on matters of household management, as though her thoughts carried weight equal to his own. Catherine delighted in planning every aspect of the modest celebration, selecting autumn flowers for the chapel and consulting with the cook about Eleanor's favorite dishes for the wedding breakfast, and she would appear in Eleanor's chambers each evening to discuss the day's progress with such obvious pleasure that Eleanor found herself laughing more freely than she had in decades. And the young woman said one night with satisfaction, "I knew from the moment I met you that you were exactly what Uncle Alexander needed, someone who would value him for himself rather than his title, someone whose heart had been tested enough to recognize true worth when it appeared." And Eleanor embraced her with gratitude for this unexpected ally who had schemed so charmingly on their behalf. On the eve of her wedding, Eleanor sat alone in her chamber as dusk gathered outside her window and allowed herself to fully contemplate the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. From invisible companion resigned to permanent spinsterhood to beloved bride of one of England's most powerful peers, and she wondered at the courage it had taken to accept what he offered, despite every reasonable objection her mind could manufacture. And then a footman delivered a sealed letter in the Duke's distinctive hand, and she opened it with trembling fingers to read his words, "My dearest Eleanor, tomorrow I will speak vows that bind us in the eyes of God and society. But know that my heart has been yours since those first days at Somerset, when you showed me what it meant to be truly seen. Thank you for having the courage to accept the love I offer, Thank you for teaching me that the best things in life come not to those who follow convention, but to those brave enough to claim what their hearts know to be true. I count the hours until I may call you my wife." And Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest and felt tears of pure happiness slip down her cheeks as she whispered into the gathering darkness a prayer of gratitude for this unexpected grace. The wedding took place on a morning when October sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the Duke's private chapel on his Derbyshire estate, transforming the small sacred space into a jewel box of coloured light that danced across the ancient stone floor, and Eleanor stood in the vestibule in her gown of cream silk that fell in elegant lines from her shoulders to the floor, holding a simple bouquet of autumn roses and golden chrysanthemums that Catherine had gathered from the estate gardens at dawn. And she felt her hands trembling as the organ began to play, and she understood that in moments she would walk down that short aisle to where Alexander waited for her. This man who had somehow seen past every limitation society had placed upon her worth and chosen her anyway. The chapel held only their truest friends, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford in the front pew with Lady Somerset beside her, both women dabbing at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, and Catherine beaming with such obvious delight at her matchmaking success, and a handful of the Duke's oldest companions who had known him long enough to recognize genuine happiness when they witnessed it. And as Eleanor began her solitary walk down the aisle, she raised her eyes to find Alexander watching her with such naked emotion that she nearly faltered, for his expression held none of the ducal composure she had grown accustomed to seeing him wear in public, but instead revealed a vulnerability that made her heart clench with protective tenderness. They stood together before the elderly chaplain who had served the Thornwood family for 40 years, and when the moment came for Alexander to speak his vows, his voice broke with emotion as he promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life. And Eleanor felt tears slip down her own cheeks as she made her responses, binding herself to this extraordinary man who had taught her that it was never too late for joy. And when the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife and Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and then drew her close for their first kiss as a married couple, she heard Catherine's delighted laugh ring out in the small chapel and felt something inside her chest that had been locked away for decades, finally, completely open. The wedding breakfast that followed in the estate's morning room was an intimate affair of champagne and delicate pastries, and the kind of easy conversation that flows among people who genuinely care for one another, and Eleanor found herself laughing freely at the toasts offered in their honor, particularly Catherine's, which declared that she took full credit for the match and expected to be godmother to any future children, a suggestion that made Eleanor blush even as Alexander squeezed her hand beneath the table and murmured that he found the idea not at all objectionable. They departed in the early afternoon for the Duke's hunting lodge deep in the Derbyshire hills, a place he had chosen specifically because it offered complete privacy from the world, and the journey through the autumn countryside passed in a haze of quiet conversation and comfortable silences, Alexander's hand holding hers as though he feared she might somehow disappear if he released his grip. And when they arrived at the lodge as twilight gathered, Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness at what the night would bring, for she was 40 years old and had never known a man's intimate touch, and Alexander seemed to sense her trepidation, for he led her inside, and before anything else showed her the library he had prepared, with her favorite books and a comfortable chair positioned to catch the morning light, and he said softly, "I want you to know that this is your home now, that every room in it is yours, and we shall proceed in all things at whatever pace brings you comfort," and his gentleness undid her completely. That first night passed in tender discovery, both emotional and physical, Alexander's patient reverence as he helped her from her gown and showed her with touch and whispered words how deeply he cherished every part of her, and Eleanor marveled at the sensations she had never imagined she would experience. The intimacy of being held and known and desired, not despite her years, but in full recognition of everything those years had made her. And afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, with her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, Alexander pressed a kiss to her hair and said with wonder in his voice, "You have taught me what marriage should be, Eleanor. Not a transaction of titles and property, but a meeting of minds and hearts, a partnership between equals who choose each other freely." And Eleanor felt such profound gratitude for the courage she had summoned to accept what he offered that she wept, and he held her close and understood that these were tears of joy rather than sorrow, the release of every lonely year that had come before this perfect beginning. 5 years later, Eleanor sat in the morning room of Thornwood House, surrounded by correspondence and autumn sunlight that streamed through the tall windows and illuminated the cream wallpaper with its delicate pattern of climbing roses, and she paused in her reading of a letter from the Dowager Duchess of Ashford to smile at the sound of Catherine's laughter drifting from the garden, where the young woman, now 22 and recently engaged herself, was walking with her betrothed, and Eleanor marveled, as she often did, at the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. For she was now 45 years old, and the Duchess of Thornwood, a woman whose opinions were sought on matters of estate management and whose presence at social gatherings was valued not for her title alone, but for the intelligence and compassion she brought to every conversation. The room itself bore evidence of her influence: shelves lined with her beloved books, and a comfortable chair positioned to catch the morning light, where she spent hours reading or writing letters to the network of friends she had cultivated, women of various ages, who had found in her story encouragement to live authentically rather than according to society's narrow prescriptions. And on the wall hung her portrait, recently commissioned by Alexander, painted not in formal ducal splendor, but seated in the library at Thornwood, with a book in her hands and a gentle smile on her face, and it hung in the gallery among all the previous duchesses, as though she had always belonged there. The door opened, and Alexander entered with the purposeful stride she had come to know so well, and though silver now threaded more liberally through his dark hair and fine lines had deepened around his eyes, he remained to her the most handsome man she had ever known. And more importantly, he had grown only more tender with time, more openly affectionate, more willing to speak the feelings that had once remained locked behind ducal reserve, and he crossed to where she sat and pressed a kiss to the top of her head before settling into the chair beside hers and reaching for her hand in the gesture that had become their constant communion. "Catherine seems very happy," he observed, glancing toward the window, and Eleanor smiled and replied that young love was a beautiful thing to witness. And Alexander squeezed her hand and said quietly, "No more beautiful than enduring love, my dear," and she felt her heart swell with the same gratitude she experienced daily for the courage she had summoned to accept what he offered 5 years ago. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment before Alexander spoke again, telling her that he had received a letter from an old friend whose nephew wished to court a woman 10 years his senior and was facing family opposition, and he had written back encouraging the young man to follow his heart rather than convention. And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this evidence that their happiness had rippled outward to touch other lives, giving others permission to pursue love in whatever form it appeared. Dear listener, I share this story not as mere romantic fancy, but as testimony to a truth our world too often forgets, that worth is not determined by youth or conventional beauty or adherence to society's arbitrary timelines, but by the depth of character that comes from living fully and feeling deeply, and having the courage to remain open to possibility, even when every reasonable voice counsels resignation. Eleanor's story reminds us that our season for joy is not dictated by the calendar or the cruel whispers of those who measure value in such shallow terms, but by our willingness to recognize and claim what our hearts know to be true when it finally appears. Perhaps you too have heard those voices telling you that certain opportunities have passed, that certain dreams are no longer appropriate for someone of your years, that you should accept a smaller life than the one your heart still yearns for. But I encourage you to remember Eleanor standing in that library at 40 years old, convinced her life was settled and small, having no idea that her greatest adventure was only just beginning. Your season is not past. It may only just be beginning, and the courage to hope again, to risk again, to open your heart to unexpected grace is never wasted, even if the outcome differs from what you imagined. May you find the strength to see yourself as you truly are, rather than as the world would diminish you. May you have the courage to accept love and joy and possibility when they appear in whatever form they take, and may you rest tonight, knowing that every year you have lived has refined you into exactly who you need to be for whatever comes next. For more stories of hope and unexpected beginnings, subscribe to Chronicles of the Heart, and may your dreams be peaceful and your tomorrows bright.